Welcome one and all to Influence Music Podcast, exploring new music and making connections back to previous musical generations via panel debates, conversations and interviews with artists, enthusiasts and media insiders. That was a lovely cough there by Mark. Just do that again for me, Mark. A beautiful cough.
Let me clear my throat.
Welcome one and all to episode 4 of Influence Music Podcast. For all you new listeners, thank you for joining us. For everyone that's listened to the previous episodes, I hope you've enjoyed them. And we're back again with a new subject, a new topic, and the same old panel. Music artist and radio host Mark Anthony. Mark, you cool?
All good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me back on the show.
And also Lee, the new beat maker. Lee, what's happening?
Very good, thank you. Same old Lee, the new beat maker. Same old Mark. Hello, same old listeners, hopefully, and same old new listeners, hopefully too. I've got a bit of hay fever. I'm going to struggle through. I'm not a hero. Don't give me any sort of credit for being a hero, okay?
Get down to Boots, get some Pyritine.
Other chemists and other
yeah, are available.
Yeah. But good to see you all, folks.
I spoke to the guys a few weeks ago and wanted to know what their most influential hip hop album was. So, like an album that meant something to them. So it wasn't the greatest album, just the one that meant a lot to them. It was an interesting topic because there's so many albums to pick through. I found it really difficult myself to pick one. I picked one due to a personal connection. So I suppose we better go through and tell everybody what we've picked. Mark, what did you go for?
The album I picked was Reaching by the Digable Planets.
And Lee?
I went for Donuts by the late, great J Dilla.
And I went for Snoop Doggy Dogg's Doggy Style. So, all very different albums. Not gonna lie, I love the J Dilla Donuts album. The Digable Planets album, I know of it, especially because of the rebirth of Slick. But after Mark had mentioned it, I revisited it, but I'll let Mark talk about that first. Who wants to go and talk about their album first?
Lee.
People will be surprised that I chose a hip-hop album, which is purely instrumental. Because I think in 2020, we often think of hip-hop and rapping as being synonymous. But with the little KRS-One hat on, of course, you know, the elements of hip-hop, DJing, breakdancing, graffiti, rapping. In the late 70s, Kool Herc, Afrika Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash, primarily DJs, primarily people who, you know, take their favourite part of the record and they would loop it, bring it back, so to speak, play it over two different versions of the same record to keep the party going. There was a long time in hip-hop culture where the DJ was actually more prominent, or at least as prominent as the MCs, taking it back to the eras of the DJ being king, so to speak. I think that J Dilla, the title King and King of Beats, is one that is very appropriate to him. It sounds glib to call Donuts a instrumental hip-hop album, because I think it's a little bit like calling the film Blue by Derek Jarman just a film. Okay, here goes. Listeners, especially with COVID-19 and George Floyd and all these different things going on where we are in the middle of an existential crisis. I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say existential crisis. The next few moments might be quite uncomfortable. So if you have anxiety about mortality or if you're currently grieving or anything like that, you might want to skip the next couple of minutes. J Dilla's Donuts was curated, compiled, created, etc. When J Dilla, I mean, we can't speak for what the next man knows or doesn't know, but J Dilla was in very, very poor health. And this album, to me, is the sound of one man telling his friends and family he loves them. It's also an album where there's fear, there's joy, there's spirit, there's triumph, there's darkness. But I also think he really tips his hat to the producers that came before him, almost like a testimonial to them. But there's just something about how J Dilla takes influences from people like Pete Rock, Just Blaze, Public Enemy, the Bomb Squad, and Public Enemy, and the RZA on this album. Tipped his hat to all these people, but in a very hip-hop, very postmodern way. It wasn't lazy and Pete Rock by numbers, or Public Enemy by numbers. So here is an album where, if we talk about the podcast influenced, Jay Dilla was super influenced by all these different artists, and on Donuts he pays tribute to them. 2006, I was very much starting to get into the layering of drums and how to stretch vocal samples and how to stretch samples and things like that from a, wow, how do they do that technically? I went from, oh, that sounds dope, to that sounds dope, and how do they do that? I mean, I'd already had those moments with artists like Pete Rock and Seal Smooth, and always loved the magic, the audio alchemy of sampling. It wasn't the first instrumental hip-hop album. You've got DJ Crush and DJ Shadow and other fantastic artists who did instrumental hip-hop albums earlier. But there's a pre-Donuts and a post-Donuts. There's really a BC and an AD as far as Jay Dilla's Donuts album and how it's influenced so much music afterwards. On my playlist, you will find The Roots and Erykah Badu and Madlib, who were all peers and people that he worked with in his lifetime. If Jay Dilla's Donuts is the perfect or the quintessential album to investigate and listen to an artist exploring their imminent demise, then The Roots Game Theory, Erykah Badu's New America, and especially Madlib's Dill Cosby, Dill Withers suite are the sound of artists coming to terms with the passing of a longtime peer, collaborator, friend, and influence. Elsewhere on the playlist, I've got artists such as Mecca83, who flies the Q-tip and the Jay Dilla flag high. I've also got music by SK, whose album Serenity is another hip-hop album dealing with grief. Of course, there was Beat Tape Culture before Donuts, but after Donuts, again, it was like a BC and an AD. So artists like Knowledge, Ackright, Illingsworth, who was a friend of mine, shout out to Illingsworth, and he's got some links to people like DJ House Shoes, so there's a 6 degrees of separation from Jay Dilla there. None of those artists came out and went, I want to be Jay Dilla and I'm going to pretend to be Jay Dilla. But they all fly the Jay Dilla flag. So yeah, if this is your first time, I advise listening to Donuts in its entirety from beginning to end, with no other sort of media involved. Then go and listen to the story or watch some documentaries. And if you are hardcore into Donuts, you probably already read Donuts 33 1/3 by the author Jordan Ferguson. If it's all right, I'd also like to put a link to my own article that I wrote for bboytechreport.com. I'm hoping there'll be a link for that in the show. But yeah, Jay Dilla's Donuts is the sound of an artist paying tribute to those who influenced him, and at the same time influencing beat makers, beat tapes, production, and generation for a long time to come. So rest in peace to Jay Dilla, and I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great pick. I love the album. I found the album from that Giles Peterson show back in the day. Anyone out there that does like the album, I do believe that the Jazz Cafe are doing a Jay Dilla tribute, and then that is then followed by a live performance by Illa J. Jay Dilla's brother. Yeah. So again, if someone wants to check out the music live, that would be a good opportunity to do it. But yeah, it completely changed my music taste. I mean, you're right, it's a BCAD. Like after that, nothing was the same. And and now you'll find me, on those, the Meccas, the Comaneci's, the Vanillas, the Knowledges. In my albums of the next 6 months, which we're going to be posting on the podcasts, on the blog soon, there are like 4 albums that are just hip hop instrumentals, or of that ilk. So definitely a very influential album. A brave album to pick because, like you said, there's no vocals in it. So the first thought when you think of a hip hop album is a rap album. But it's very quintessentially it is an iconic hip hop album, and it changed the format. I mean, guy's an icon. Yeah. So rest in peace, J Dilla, and thanks, Lee. Thanks for that one.
Thank you for giving me the platform to again preach the gospel of J Dilla and donuts.
My album is Snoop Doggy Dogg's Doggy Style. The album was released in 1993. I was 12 at the time. So I love this album because musically it's brilliant, but it has a real kind of personal touch for me. In 1992, Dr. Dre released his debut album on Death Row Records after leaving NWA called The Chronic, and it was sensational. And he kind of re-established himself with this G-Funk sound, but beyond anything that he'd done before. And the standout tracks on it were Nothing But a G Thing, which had a great sample of, or a loop of Leon Haywood's I Just Don't Want to Do Something Freaky to You. Also Lil Ghetto Boy, which is again another sample from a Donny Hathaway track, and Ride With Me, which is another sample of a great Funkadelic track. So those real kind of 70s funk influences rode through those tracks. And growing up in my household, my dad was a massive George Clinton fan, so I had a direct connection to those tracks without even realising it. I thought I liked them because it was cool hip hop, but one of the reasons why I liked them was because it was part of my upbringing. You know, I'd been surrounded by that type of music all my life, and I just hadn't realised it. But the two of those tracks featured a new young artist who's just 19 years of the age, who kind of steals the track vocally, and that was Snoop. And everyone went mad with his kind of lucid, cool flow that just went really well with those sort of 70s funk loops, and it was just brilliant. It was just a brilliant merge. So, move on a year, everybody's waiting for Snoop's album. I mean, it's the first time I think that I actually anticipated an album. Prior to that, I was too young to really care. Like, you heard music on the radio, but at this point, I'm at secondary school, I'm old enough to be into my music. There's that kind of air of naughtiness about it, because after NWA, all those albums have to have that explicit lyric sticker on them. And, you know, there's an age group, you can't just walk into the shop and buy it. You have to be a certain age to go and get those. So I asked my dad if I can have this album, without my mum knowing. And bear in mind, back in these days, you couldn't get the albums when they were released in the US because we had different release times. So my dad, being the legend that he was, drove up to the West End, went to Tower Records and bought 2 copies of it straight off the US market. So one for me and one for himself. And I was like, Dad, why are you trying to be cool? Like, you could have just bought me one. You're not that hip. And then I realised that my dad knew more about the Doggy Style album than I ever would, because every single track he could call out the sample, the year, the artist, to some extent even the point in the record where that sample comes from. Being a vinyl DJ, that was the nature of what we do. You have to stop the record at that break. It is part of Dre's genius as well, because a lot of those samples that he uses on that album are the outros to Funkadelic records. They're not even the main body of the record. It's his experience of being a vinyl DJ where he said, that's the bit, that's the point. And that's why on my playlist, although this album is just iconic to me, I have only put tracks that he has sampled to make the album. Because I think we all know how good Snoop is. He's gone on to be probably the most famous rapper of all time. I'm not saying the best, but the most famous. And that flow is second to none. But that G-Funk sound is called funk because that is where it came from. And that was part of Dre's genius, but that's why I love it so much, because my dad and me had a connection, and it made me realise that you don't just need to listen to what you're hearing, you can do your research. I mean, pretty much this album led to this podcast. Without that album and me making those kind of generational connections, I wouldn't even be in having this chat with you guys now about the music. So there was other little kind of really smart things that Dre did in the album. So one of the really clever things is that he made it for the streets, especially for the streets of LA. And it's not just funk albums. There's a few Santana tracks in there as well. And that's really smart because that then connects to the Latino market. So, you know, he's a product of his surroundings, but he also realised that not only am I stretching out to the black community, but I'm stretching out to my community in LA, which was predominantly black and Latino.
Black and brown pride, baby.
Exactly. And I love that. There's other things I like is that there's tracks on there like Bernard Wright's I'm not if I can say this right, Habitable Home Trobbing, which basically he's just used the track and then Snoop's rapped over it, and it's just a pure genius. Like, you would just be like, what? But if you go back and listen to these tunes, there's no way you won't realise. And the thing is, because the album's iconic for me, I go back and listen to these 70s funk tracks, but I still spit Snoop's lyrics. Where my dad would sing the vocals, I still relate to them as being Snoop track. Yeah, so a brilliant album, something that everybody should check out. Also, a big shout out to Dre and Snoop for doing little like classy touches to say we love this music as well. So we're not just going to sample it; we're going to put people like the Dramatics on the album who come on and have a little cameo. So yeah, massive album. Everyone should listen to it. But please check out the playlist so you can see what I'm talking about in terms of the samples. Oh, and also to get an understanding of Dre's thought process behind making albums like this, the documentary Defiant Ones is a brilliant reference point to kind of understand how his mind works. And that's me done.
Even though I'll speak about it more when we come on to my choice, but I was heavily into hip hop around that time. Me and Mark are, a similar ages. I know you wouldn't think it because I'm quite young looking, but me and Mark are very similar ages, and I was really bang into hip hop. And I will when I go into sort of my choice of album, I'll tell you about the way that I was able to sort of like purchase those kind of albums myself, because Mark did reference the explicit sticker, which didn't really help us youngsters at the time. But yeah, great memories. When I was growing up in North London, aside from football, all me and my friends used to do was just hang around our estate imitating rappers. Dre and Snoop were probably the two main rappers that we'd try and imitate. So, the album was very, very nostalgic for me. And I remember being heavily into it, as I was into The Chronic by Dre as well. So it really hit, a really nice nostalgic note for me. And I still listen to the album now. So I think that's a great pick.
There are certain albums that I think of when I think that, oh boy, I can't wait for this album. One is Fear of a Black Planet by Public Enemy, Illmatic by Nas.
Oh yeah.
Where I was when I was damn near checking on the calendar, like, wait, it comes out on which date, right? And the third is Snoop Doggy Dogg's Doggy Style. It shifted. It shook the whole musical landscape.
It was the fastest selling debut album ever. Yeah, and you're right. It's another one of those albums which music isn't made that way anymore. But it was a complete story, and I think you find that with the skits, because sometimes when he can get a bit deep and a bit dark, and Snoop has this ability to kind of talk to you about the reality of his surroundings, and you kind of forget about it because he's so smooth. But then those skits give the comic element to kind of balance it out, to level it out. So yeah, it's a complete body of work. I mean, it's blinding. It's absolutely blinding. Mark, let's hear what you got to say.
So the album, as I said at the beginning of the show, that I chose was Reaching from the Diggable Planets. Now, it's similar to Mark. There's quite a nostalgic story behind it, because I remember at the time in the early 90s, myself and my friends were heavily into hip-hop, aside from football, because we're all mad either Arsenal or Liverpool fans. Aside from football, we were really, really big into hip-hop, and what we used to do around our estate in Finsbury Park in North London, we just used to sort of try and imitate rappers and write down the lyrics that we thought that we heard, because you didn't have any sort of internet in those days where you can look up lyrics and stuff. And some of the really huge influential albums at the time that I used to listen to were The Low End Theory from Tribe Called Quest, Wu-Tang Clan, Enter the Wu-Tang, Dre, The Chronic, as we referenced earlier, Snoop Dogg, Doggy Style, and Tribe Called Quest again with Midnight Marauders. So those were really, really huge albums in my childhood. And then I remember around 1993, I remember listening to a new track that I hadn't heard before called Rebirth of Slick. And I thought, oh, okay, this is a little bit different, because arguably a lot of the hip hop I used to listen to at that time were a bit more modern for the day and probably a little bit more kind of aggressive. And this was a little bit new because it was incorporating a load of jazz samples. And jazz was something that was played in my house constantly, although not by myself, but from my parents. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. And then when they brought out the album, that gave me a reason to check out the album. And it was really, really different to the albums I was into at the time, because they really were heavy in terms of incorporating, jazz samples. And it was a little bit more perhaps melodic, maybe. And the album themselves, it was a really kind of like in-house production work from the Digable Planets, because the album itself was actually produced by one of the members, probably the founding member of the Digable Planets, who was Ishmael Butler. It was really just all about using the resources that they had, because they will tell you themselves they didn't have the big machine behind them, and they weren't known as one of the big hip hop players at the time. It was very kind of in-house production. They used to write for themselves. They were really, really influenced by DJ Premier at the time. And most people, I would say, would connect themselves or have a connection with Digable Planets via the Rebirth of Slick tune, which was a big, big hit in 1993. And I guess in terms of the singles they've released, they've probably never equaled that. But it has been listed in a number of, it's been recognised in a number of sort of avenues, such as The Source, as one of the best 100 sort of hip-hop albums, and even VH1 regarded Rebirth of Slick to be one of the greatest hip-hop albums in the top 100. So, it did have they were heavily acknowledged for their work, although what I will say is, against some of the albums I referenced earlier, like Doggy Style and The Chronic, they never equaled the commercial success of those albums. But I guess, for this show, it was more about just speaking about what the album meant to me. And I still listen to the album today. And some of the tracks that I've referenced on the playlist are some of the lesser known tracks, such as Time and Space, It's Good to Be Here, which was actually a single, Where I'm From was a single, Last of the Spitty Ox, which is an album track, Appointment at the Fat Clinic, and inevitably Rebirth of Slick. But that was my choice of album. And I think one of the funny stories, and Mark reminded me of it, is when I used to go just up to Wood Green in North London to try and buy music, because a lot of my influences were very, very much hip-hop influenced music. They would not sell me the tracks because I wasn't perhaps old enough or whatever. And in the end, I remember I used to go to Chapel Market down in Angel, where you did have this Del Boy type person in a suitcase who used to sell 3 albums for a tenner. And it literally was a situation where you would go up to this suitcase. I can't even say it was a stall. It wasn't a stall. It was just a suitcase. And you'd be in the middle of looking at the albums they've got, or you've gone all the way, you've looked forward to the Saturday, so you can go down there on a Saturday morning and get the album, because you always have the latest albums, and then from a bit of a distance, you'd have the lookout shouting, "Bacon, bacon, bacon!" And then they shut the suitcase and leg it, and you think, "No!" And it just reminds me of funny times like that. But 3 cassette albums for a tenner was a good deal. You just had to catch them at the right moment when the police weren't around. So that was my little kind of nostalgic, part of my nostalgic moment for picking the album.
I'm glad you picked the album, because it's made me revisit it. So, like you just said, Rebirth of Slick is a tune, like it's always been a tune. When that double bass comes in, boom, 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 and then the trumpets, ba-ba-da, ba-ba-da. Like, I've known that. But other than that track, I couldn't honestly tell you another song by them. And I was talking to Lee about it off air. At that age, there was an air of their reality being my reality, and that wasn't attractive to me. It was attractive to hear about these guys in South Central LA and how tough they had it and their lifestyles, and that was considered cool at school. But these guys were talking about problems in life, and they come from an environment probably quite similar to mine, which should have made it more relatable. But as a kid, it's not what I wanted to hear. So now, when I've revisited it now, I love it. Like, it kind of feels like the evolution of Eric B and Rakim. Like, that move forward from there, and with them being kind of highly intellectual, I would say reasonably middle class, I think it probably acted as a detriment to them in the industry in terms of consumerism. But don't take it away from the music. The music's fantastic.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right, because if you think of the main hip hop albums that were big at the time, a lot of the themes were about struggles, weren't they? They were about real kind of struggles in living in the hood, and they were quite political, I'd say.
Being a nerd, the top-selling hip-hop album in 92 is The Chronic. The top-selling hip-hop album in 93 is Doggy Style. And the top-selling hip-hop album in 1994 is Ready to Die by Biggie. Yeah. So it just shows you what the trend was at the time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that arguably middle class perhaps rappers mixing hip hop and jazz, as you said, the music's excellent. I mean, I absolutely love the music, but it probably wouldn't have stood. Well, it didn't stand up to the albums that were released at the time, just because I think of the trend at the time being wanted to hear about real struggles. And I think there was a load of problems in society, and people like Dre, Snoop, even going back to NWA, were very, very vocal about those problems. And I think that's what a lot of people, especially black people, wanted to hear.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, when I was talking off air to Lee, we compared it to kind of the Arrested Development kind of situation as well, where, they were a bit out there, and other than Mr. Wendell, like, people don't really know their music either, but I think it's because they fall in that same format. But a great pick. I'm really happy that you picked it. I love the picks that you've got on the playlist to go with it, because it's that kind of, like you said, it's got Tribe in it. You put Farside in there, that kind of jazz influenced hip hop that became my mainstay. Like, after that, and Midnight Marauders. I think we could have a show just on that album.
Oh wow! Yeah, I could talk about that album forever.
So fantastic pick.
Here's a confession of mine. I remember where I'm from. I remember the Rebirth of Slick. I am guilty of sleeping on the album when it came out. And in my defense, 1993 was such a dope year in hip-hop that there were so many amazing albums that this Digable Planets album would be arguably the greatest album of 2020 if it was released this year. And in 1993, there was too much of a good thing. What is very interesting is how we quickly started to talk about. There were some assumptions made, like, Digable Planets, they probably had a middle-class background or words to that effect, and how the album is, quote-unquote, more middle-class than, let's say, Doggy Style. I mean, the working class lads and the lower class lads that I hung around with, yeah, very much into Doggy Style over Diggable Planets. I think it says a lot about our society, how we quickly peg certain things, even in hip-hop, as being lower class or middle class and such. I mean, I'm just having a quick look here because an OK Player interview with Ishmael Butler says that Ishmael Butler Butterfly, Ladybug Mecca, and Doodlebug. Doodlebug is a 5%er, and they grew up in households shaped by the Black Liberation Movement. Mecca's parents were active in liberation movement in Brazil. Craig Doodlebug Irvin's father was a member of the Black Panthers, and Ishmael's parents participated in the Black Liberation Movement. So not for a second are we saying, sounds a bit more middle class, or this is something that's going to gravitate towards middle class ears, and these folks must have had it easy. I mean, the Black Panthers and Black Liberation household may have been more middle class because middle class people have more access to information.
Yeah, I mean,
interest in it, of course, is that New York hip hop at the time. A lot of it goes back to those 5%ers, Nation of Gods and Earths. Mark Williams said this sounded like an evolution or the sons and daughters of Eric B. and Rakim. Eric B. and Rakim being 5%ers, being influenced by DJ Premier and Guru, Gang Starr, very much steeped in that 5% knowledge of self. The 90s hip-hop was so, especially on the East Coast, Nation of Gods and Earth and 5%ers and such.
The vital point is that by the time we got to 93, a big player in terms of how much money you made was White America in terms of purchasing hip-hop albums.
70% of hip-hop albums are purchased by non-black people, apparently.
Yeah, so
at least in that era.
So in that era, you know, it was kind of glamorous to hear about the lives of these people that are riding around with AKs and dealing drugs, and like you said, White America doesn't want to hear about the 5%ers.
No.
They don't want to hear about that at all. So, no. I mean, I think, yeah, like, you're right. I think for commercial reasons, that's one of the reasons why not just I slept on the album, but he didn't have the success that those other albums did. Yeah, was because of that. It's fine to talk about, you know, gangster rap and black guys in the ghetto killing each other because it's glamorous. But not only that, the government is kind of like saying, oh, yeah, okay, all right, that's fine. Let's just tarnish them with that image, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's a different time, a different era, but very good point.
Amazing that 1993 had both albums that were so influential to us three.
The contrast of it, and it's you're right, because like what the Diggable Planets are talking about, like I said before, is relatable to me, more relatable to anything that Snoop ever said, like to my lifestyle, to my living, to what was like here. So yeah, I mean, again, it's a different way of consuming music as you get older. What attracts you to a song or an album changes, and the context of it makes an impact.
Yeah, definitely. Just want to say, Lee, there were really, really good points that I think will give anyone a bit of food for thought. I think they're really, really good points, and in a way, and I'm going to flip it around a little bit, is some people could argue that they kept it real more because, as Mark Williams said, a lot of people used to rap about AK-47s and guns and the lifestyle because it was glamorous. And there could be an argument to say that, in a way, Diggable Planets kept it real more because they didn't go along with the glamour. They just rapped about their lives. And as you have quite rightly said, actually, there is an assumption because they were more middle class, because the album probably wasn't as raw and angry as a lot of the other albums, but looking in their backgrounds, they were kind of far from it, and I think that's really
cool. I mean, there's loads of examples of it. We're going into discussion here, and I love it, but Public Enemy is a prime example of it. Public Enemy didn't have the commercial success until they got Flavor Flav.
Yeah, true.
Until you had that point where you had that kind of light-hearted, comical kind of balance to the political hard edge of Chuck D. They never had that commercial success, because if it's just Chuck D on his own, that's too much. That's too much for commercial is. That's what that is.
There's a Jay Electronica song called "A Day," and he says, "My mama told me, son, always call a spade a spade. Be like Chuck D, never be like Flavor Flav. But that clock around his neck is so fly, and the way he complimented Chucky with that bow tie flow make me feel high. So I'm gonna spit it my way."
Yeah.
They need one another.
They need one another.
They're both so fly, as he put it. Mark Williams picked an album that was produced by Dr. Dre, who, as Mark Williams said, grew up in the DJ era, and what parts of the record get the people most hyped. I picked Jay Dilla's Donuts, and I said, here is a hip-hop album with no rapping on it, because the DJ. And Mark Anthony had an album where the DIY aesthetic, especially in Jay Dilla's Donuts, of not having such a big machine behind you, but also go collect the household, the music that was heard out, the household of Ishmael Butler, known as Butterfly, known as Ish, who is now part of, or at least the man behind Shabazz Palaces, which is an amazing project in its own right, and more on that at a later time. But again, this thing of using what you have and basically being a DJ, and also as a massive Gang Starr fan and a massive DJ Premier fan, my face lights up anytime anyone pays homage to DJ Premier.
Thank you both for giving me your personal stories and sharing it with us and your musical experiences with those albums. I hope the listener enjoyed what we had to say about them. I'd love it if you could take it away and have a think about your personal experience with an iconic album like that, and let us know what they are. Maybe there might be an album that we haven't mentioned. Obviously, depending on what age group you fall in, that album, that cycle kind of changes. Thanks again, guys, once again.
Thank you.
All right, speak to you guys later. Have a good one, yeah? Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Hit us up on Influence Music Podcast on Instagram, or you can get us on influencepodcast.co.uk, which is our blog. Shows always posted on all the normal formats: iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, etc., etc. Episode 5, the next theme, our favourite album since 2010, and we look forward to speaking to you about it. Take care. Bye all. Influence Music Podcast. We exploring new music and making connections back to previous musical generations via panel debates, conversations and interviews with artists, enthusiasts and media insiders.